Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
I'm Rivka Schwartz, and we're here for our second session of Dirshu et Shlom Ha'ir, American Jews and American Citizenship. This is part of SAR High School's adult education series, but it's also being done as part of the work of Machon Siach, honoring the memory of Belda K. Lindenbaum. So the work on citizenship, as I mentioned last time, that I've been doing this year, I've been doing as part of the Machon Siach cohort, and this reflects some of that work. Last time, we tried to look at some manifestations within traditional Jewish sources of how we think about or relate to the governments under which we live. And we looked at quite a few sources that reflected an attitude of essentially that you assume the government is indifferent to you, if not actively hostile, and that your primary concern is to protect yourself and to make sure that you are okay or taken care of. So you seek out the well-being of the government because if the society in which you live is stable and prosperous, the Jews will be better off. And then at the end we looked at and we entertained some other sources that suggested that we might have a different kind of relationship with the government under which we live, a kind of broader sense of its values, of its contribution, beyond just what it does for me or what I benefit from. But if we're talking about how American Jews relate to American citizenship, I think it's important as it is to trace the Jewish sources and to see what the Jewish sources say, it's important not to get hung up offering explanations that date back 700 or 500 or 1500 years, sometimes for phenomena that are really 50 or 60 years old. In other words, we can trace a long arc of Jewish history that talks about how Jews relate to the governments around them. But if we want to talk about American Jews' relationships to American society and American government, we also have to look at some of the developments within American society in the past 50, 60, 70 years that American Jews are very much part of and participants in, and understand that sometimes American Jews' behavior as citizens is explained better by American Jews reflecting the society around them than it is explained by American Jews being distinctive or apart, reflecting their distinctive Jewishness. So I just would like, again, to try to make very clear what the thesis of today's session is. If last time we were talking about distinctively Jewish attitudes or approaches to thinking about how we engage with the government under which we live, today I'm going to be talking about some developments in which I think American Jews actually reflect the society in which we live and the specific stratum of society that we inhabit. And I'm actually going to argue that both of these things, the ways in which we are distinctive as Jews and the ways in which we reflect developments or trends in American society in the past 2 or 3 generations, both of those things, I think, push us away from a kind of broad civic engagement with the values of our society and with the needs of Americans as a whole, and push us towards a more self-interested model, which ultimately I think, and as I'm pretty sure I was clear about last time, but just in case I'm not clear, I want to put my cards on the table. Ultimately, I think that's something that we should be working against and that we should be educating our kids, our students against, meaning we should be educating towards a broader sense of civics, of citizenship, of investment, beyond just what's in it for me. But I think there are actually a lot of factors that push us in the direction of what's in it for me. Again, I talked about last time some of the historical approaches that as Jews have had us thinking that way. Because again, basically we see the government as not being our friend particularly. And so the most that we can do is look out for and protect our own interests. Right? That was last time. And now this time I want to talk about a very different set of phenomena, much more recent developments in American society, but again, that we are very much participants in, part of, that push us to a similar kind of thing. Disengagement from a broader sense of the common good, and more focus on what are my needs and how am I meeting them. Okay? So there is a whole bunch of social science research that has been done about a large number of interrelated, interlocking phenomena in American life over the past, I'm going to say 50 to 70 years, but really accelerating in the past 40 or 50 years, which have driven towards a kind of atomization, sorting, stratification in American society. I'm going to talk about all of those things, what I mean by them, and what I'm talking about. But first I actually want to tell you a story or an illustration. My father had two brothers. They both passed away within the space of about a year and a half. And so twice within about a year and a half, we went to funerals, two big cemeteries, two big Jewish cemeteries out on Long Island next door to each other, Wellwood and Beth Moses. In the space of about a year and a half, I made that endless trip out to like the end of no place twice.
Tell me about it.
And as you walk through the cemetery, it's really striking to me to see what the groups, what the divisions in the cemetery are. Because sure, there are some for shuls, right? This shul owns this set of plots, that shul owns that set of plots, and you could buy a plot with your shul. But there are also, I'm not sure what it's called, like what's that unit of cemetery plots? But it's not just chevers, there's like a block or whatever it's precisely called that's owned by a fraternal organization, a Jewish fraternal organization, the Knights of Pythias. And if you're a member of the Knights of Pythias, then you can have a plot in that block. And there are blocks for various Landsmannschaften. If you originated in whatever particular country in Europe, so you could join the Landsmannschaft and then you could get a burial plot in that block. And then I passed a block in the cemetery for the Brotherhood of Jewish Postal Workers. So if you were a Jew who worked for the United States Post Office and you became a member of the Brotherhood of Jewish Postal Workers, which I guess was what it sounds like, didn't do a lot of research to find out what it was, but Kishmo Kain Hu, I think its name gives a pretty clear indication of what this institution was, then you could buy a plot in the cemetery.
Synagogues have plots.
Right, so synagogues do, of course, but what was of interest to me is these other groups that have ceased existing. And that's really striking. That says to me that if you were a member of a synagogue, so you were a member of a synagogue, but let's say you weren't a particularly committed Jew. Let's say you weren't a member of a synagogue, even 50, 60, 70 years ago. There was a whole range of organizations that you could belong to that would, you'd get together with the guys and hang out once a week and drink a beer and shoot the breeze and tell stories about the post office, I guess. I'm not exactly sure. Something like that.
Territorial.
And those organizations don't exist anymore. Instead, you sit in your house and stream Netflix, I guess. And that intuition that we have, that sense that we have, that American life has gotten much more atomized, broken up into little bits, that instead of being part of some larger unifying organizations where each one of us is kind of like an individual floating through space, that intuition, that sense is reflected in a very big piece of social science research I'm about to tell you about in a minute after I answer your question.
But how much of that isn't also a reaction to the fact that other fraternal organizations were closed to Jews, so therefore Jews felt the need to make
right. So let's talk about Robert Putnam's book. So Robert Putnam, who's a social scientist at Harvard University, wrote a book called Bowling Alone. This was a book, it's like, some things come out and everybody picks them up and they launch 1,000 sermons or 1,000 op-ed pages. They become the subject of everybody's pop culture consciousness. So Bowling Alone was like that when it came out. It came out in about 2000. And Bowling Alone, it's almost like the whole thesis of the book is contained in the title. When people used to want to go bowling, they joined a bowling league. And now you go bowling alone. So I had heard about Bowling Alone endless numbers of times. I knew that Bowling Alone existed as a book. I thought it was like a kind of pop culture, like David Brooksy rumination on how we used to join organizations, but now we go bowling alone. But it was only when I started doing work on the citizenship group for Machon Siach that I actually A, bought it, and B, read it, right? So this is a good argument for not pretending that you know what books say just because you read about them in the New York Times Book Review. When I actually picked up Bowling Alone 15, 18 years after it had come out and read it, Bowling Alone is a densely researched, very statistical work of social science. It's not I kind of think because people in my neighborhood are bowling alone. He did the work to track down membership in organizations and all these kinds of things. And Robert Putnam tells us that broadly across American life, membership joining is down across the board. So Jewish, not Jewish, secular, It's down in terms of membership in churches broadly in American life. It's down in terms of membership in fraternal organizations. It's down in terms of membership in political organizations. It is down in terms of membership in unions. Whatever structure or organization you want to describe to me, and again, wherever it lands on the political spectrum or it's not on the political spectrum, whatever religious or cultural group it's meant to speak for, joining is down. Membership is down. Being part of an organization is down. We spend much more time alone. He says we spend a lot of it in our cars, going places, right? We have longer commutes to work. When you move from the city to the suburbs, even your commute is more alone. There's a world of difference between commuting on a subway with like all the rest of New York City on your commute with you and commuting alone in the car. Now you may think commuting alone in your car is a big improvement. I'm not going to argue against people who see it that way, but it's a very, very different experience. Somebody once said something to me about, city kids versus suburban kids. I live in New York City. I live in Upper Manhattan, and I've raised my children. All of my kids have lived their whole lives in Upper Manhattan. And somebody once said something about city kids versus suburban kids. And the first time I heard it, I said, that sounds like a simplistic stereotype. It doesn't really sound like it's true. That kids are that different because of where they grew up. But then I realized that, first of all, they actually are pretty different. And it's because of this. Because if my kids want to get from point A to point B, it's like, here, sweetie, here's a Metro card. Go look it up. Get a map, figure it out, and get from point A to point B. And in the process of so doing, you're going to encounter the full range of humanity that lives in New York City. And if you live in a suburban community and you want to get from point A to point B, you're going to say, Ma, can you drive me too? Right? And then you're going to get in the back of your car and your mother is or isn't going to drive you too. And that's a very different kind of experience. That's a very different way of being in the world. And that one particular example, but is really, a microcosm or represents or stands in for what Putnam describes happening broadly across American society. And again, I want to emphasize that this is not just a kind of impressionistic, here's what I think, but it's very richly researched, detailed, statistically analyzed, and he goes through, I like reading introductions, forewords and afterwords to books. There's all kinds of interesting things you learn about writers and books, not from reading their argument, but from reading the part where they tell you about how they wrote the book and how they put together the argument. So he describes that he was already a number of years into this book project when he discovered there was some flaw in his statistical analysis, and he had to go back and redo the whole thing, and it was a total disaster. But he eventually was able to do the analysis he needed to do to support that argument. And so we have become much less a country of joiners. And again, we can talk about various reasons for this. Moving to the suburbs is part of it. Longer hours at work is part of it. Longer commutes is certainly a part of it. There are certain ways in which technology facilitates this. I teach AP US government and politics. So I'm teaching my students, which will actually be the next thing that I talk about, but about political polarization in the United States. Political polarization means the extent to which people are now deeply divided and separated by politics, and that we've lined up at the polls. I'm either this or that. There's not a lot of space in the middle. There's not a lot of crossing over. There's not a lot of, I go this way, I go that way. We've become much more polarized. So for example, when they ask people, would you be upset if your child married someone from another political party? The number of people who say that I would be upset if people, again here we're assuming two political parties. If I'm a Republican, if I would be upset if my kid married a Democrat. If I'm a Democrat, I would be upset if my kid married a Republican. The numbers in response to that question have gone considerably up. I'm just going to say as an aside, it's hugely striking that of course this has happened at a time when would you be upset if your child married someone of a different religion or a different race? Those numbers have gone down, but different political party has gone way up, right? So the axes along which we identify ourselves, that particular measure of polarization, would you be upset if your child married someone of a different political party? That's gone way up. So I taught my students this in class, and I was saying to them that researchers have they're trying to account for what caused increased partisan polarization in the United States. That's a phenomenon that we can measure. It seems to have increased. What caused the increase? And they bandy about all kinds of different ideas and offer all kinds of different suggestions. And I'm not joking. This is a serious research answer that political scientists offer, that they say the advent of cable television and now offering people the option of hundreds of different channels and of customized channels. You only want to watch news from this political bent, watch it from this political bent. You only want to watch it from that political bent, watch it from that political bent. You don't want to ever have to learn about the news, so you watch Home and Garden TV for my kids. We don't have television in our house, which used to mean more than it means, right? It used to mean when my oldest, who's a senior in high school, was little, not having television in your house actually meant that my kids didn't watch television. Of course, now my 6-year-old streams cartoons on YouTube, so not having television in the house doesn't mean anything. But then we go to my in-laws' house, and the TV is still the big excitement. And my kids, the last time we were at my parents-in-law's house, my kids sat for hours watching one house-flipping show. You know, there are like so many house-flipping shows on TV?
Right.
You like buy a house and fix it up and sell it to somebody else. That's the basic idea of a house flipping show. And my kids are watching one house flipping show after another house flipping show after another house flipping show. And the fascinating thing that they argued in this article was that it's actually less about the political news, the Fox or MSNBC, and it's actually more about the 100 and 500, whatever it is, different options. Because they said it used to be that at 6 o'clock, it was CBS, ABC, and NBC. And at 6 o'clock, you know what was on? The news. And every American had to watch the news because there wasn't anything else on TV. And so you learn something altogether about politics, about society, about the war in Vietnam, about what we were doing as a country. There was like a kind of common set of issues that we knew about and we learned about and we were concerned about. And it's so interesting, the researchers suggest more than it's about a common political perspective, it's not that we all heard it from the same vantage point. It's actually that we all heard and learned about and thought about and took in kind of the same thing, as opposed to now you're watching the news because you still care about the news, but honestly I'm just watching house flipping shows on HGTV because all I'm interested in is flipping houses. And now you and I actually don't even have the common experience. Did you see what was on the news at 6 o'clock last night? And how's the war in Vietnam going? Do we trust the president? Because you're talking about, do we trust the president? And I'm talking about home garden TV and flipping houses. Okay, now that's not the only answer. I want to be clear. There's a great deal of research trying to unpack this question of political polarization. But I just want to make the point that one serious answer offered by political scientists doing serious research for political polarization is that there isn't even this common fund of knowledge or experience about like what it means to be an American citizen that we've all seen the 6 o'clock news on TV for half an hour every night. You're watching Home and Garden TV and you're watching, I don't know what you're watching. Spike TV. No, we gotta have, you're watching the cooking channel. You're watching Rachel Ray and slinging EVOO and everything, okay? So that's actually a fascinating thing that speaks again to this atomizing and breaking up into little different itty bitty groups instead of being together. Each of us is on our own, much more, in our own place, doing our own thing, separated from the broader institutions that serve to unite us. And the significance of those broader institutions that serve to unite us is great. And by institutions, again, I don't mean big institutions. I mean the Landsmannschaft, right? I mean the Brotherhood of Jewish Postal Workers. Because when I share the Brotherhood of Jewish Postal Workers with somebody, he and I might have different views about politics. We might have different thoughts about other things. But there is an axis along which we share something. We have something in common. We see ourselves together as, you know, brothers, siblings. And it builds a broader sense of investment in this broader society and this broader community, which becomes this broader society. There's a philosopher at Harvard University, Nancy Rosenbaum, who wrote a book called Good Neighbors, in which she argues that actually being a good neighbor, being in a neighborhood community kind of builds the muscles that you then need to be a good citizen. Working with other people, getting along, figuring out how to manage disputes. Your tree is hanging over into my yard. How are we going to deal with this? We want to have a block party. Do we close the street? Do we not close the street? Actually builds the muscles of citizenship. Now, whether you live in a suburb or whether you live, as I do, in an apartment building in New York City, right? The stereotype that now more and more people don't actually know the neighbors on either side of them, or we don't know them more than to say hi, or you don't know the people you meet in the hall. And again, that seems to be borne out by evidence that suggests that we are living much more individualized lives. Our entertainment is much more individualized. Our time spent is spent much more alone. And so one piece of the story, that's an important piece of the story if we're thinking about how we relate as citizens, is that broadly in our lives, we're now living much more as like individual dots in space. Now, when I learned about this, when I started to read about this, my instinctive first response is that, of course, observant Jews have a different experience. We have a different experience for a lot of reasons. We still go to shul, so we still, right, it's not like church membership in the United States is down, but we're all going to shul at least once a week. We're kind of showing up in shul for the Shabbat experience. We, Jews who don't drive on Shabbos, live together in much smaller, more closely linked communities. And so that sense of atomization, and I don't know who's who, and is much less, etc. Right? There are good reasons to make the case why the Jewish experience particularly the observant Jewish experience, if you're living in a physically close, proximate community, if you're going to shul every Shabbos, why that experience is different. And I think there is some truth to that, but I still don't think that we have completely bucked the trends. I think we are spending, we know, the data tell us, we're spending more time at work, we're spending more time in our cars, our entertainment is more atomized, there is less of a sense of shared, collective communal culture. And I will say that now this is an impression, I'm not talking about data, now I'm talking about my own impression. But my own impression is that the polarization in our community along various axes, particularly the political, has increased. Well, that's impressionistic. You can tell me it's not your impression, but it is my impression. And so I think that speaks to us, in fact, being divided along certain axes. A student of mine shared a thought with me about this, that the more I think about it, actually, the more I think it's right. And he said to me, even though we are members of shuls, we are members of shul communities, you can actually see that kind of splitting up happening even within the shul communities. Because, not the 2 Jews, 3 arguments, or whatever it is, the guy on the desert island who builds 2 shuls, the one I daven in, and one I don't daven in. He was making a very specific point, and he was making the very specific point that in the community he lives in, and in many other communities that I am familiar with, the shuls sort politically to a certain extent.
You're talking about high school students?
A high school student is observing to me about the shuls in the suburban communities in which he lives, that the shuls sort politically. That if you feel this way politically, that's the shul for you, and if you feel that way politically, that's the shul for you. Now, you can tell me if that's borne out by your experience or not, but to the extent that in certain communities you say, well, people who are more right-wing go here, and people who are more left-wing go there, people who are more conservative go here, people who are more progressive go there, that's an interesting case where even though we are still members of our shul communities, we're playing out that kind of pulling apart even as we are still members of our shul communities. You're not sure you buy
I
that.
don't have that experience in my community, but everybody knows that Stamford, Connecticut is like its own island in the middle of everything else in the world. But within the shul community, you can feel the polarization, you can feel more alone, because there's a generational divide that really happens, and it's the young people who are together. If it's not your children who are living in the community, and it's not your grandchildren living in the community, there is a big divide. The people you talk to, your friends who can't walk to shul anymore, or don't want to go to shul anymore, the allegiance to the current rabbi, the allegiance to the rabbi who left 20 years ago. So those factors form dividing lines of their own within a synagogue or a community where you really don't fall out across political lines.
Okay, so that's interesting. Some of those things may always have been factors. My guess is that some kinds of generational divides were probably always factors. Some of these things, again, the political science and social science data suggests are newer, and that I think is worth highlighting.
We're always 20 years behind.
I would say that your student's case is made or makes sense in, I don't want to limit it to and say larger urban areas, but I would say higher Jewish population areas where you do have multiplicity of synagogues, whereas in communities where the community can only support one synagogue, that would be an interesting way of studying. Do they manage?
You're so helpful because this is the second time today you've foreshadowed my next point. So this is great. I planned it right here, so you can just tell me where we're going next. So here's another thing that's a development in American life, and then I want to talk about what it looks like in Jewish communities, okay? Remember, we're talking about developments in American life that I think are pushing against a broader sense of citizenship and investment. And then we're talking about where Jews land in these developments, because I think there are certain ways in which developments in broader American life that we are echoing are militating against this broader sense of citizenship and investment. American life in the past generation or two has seen, again, what some sociologists call the big sort. S-O-R-T, the big sort, in which we are watching Americans literally vote with their feet, pick up and move to the kinds of communities they want to live in, and therefore we are watching increasing sorting by political leaning, physically where Americans live, okay? And you watch this so that large chunks of the middle of America have become increasingly politically conservative. Younger people often are moving away from those communities, right? The plain states are actually literally losing their young people. The young people are upping and moving to cities, to urban areas where they'd rather, right? You think about kind of some sort of, caricature you've heard or something where all the young people are moving to New York or Los Angeles or Portland or Austin, Texas or something, but actually that's borne out Obviously not entirely, there are young people all over the country, but that kind of sorting and people voting with their feet and being drawn back into urban areas, where 40 years ago people were fleeing urban areas as fast as their little feet could carry them. Now people are pouring back into urban areas, right? You can't find enough apartments, you can't find enough real estate, not in New York, not in Washington, D.C., not in San Francisco. All of these communities, enormous demand from young people who want to live in those communities, but it's young people of a particular political affiliation and sorting. You see it. I actually used it last year when I taught my adult ed class about the election, and I put up this giant, I have it downstairs, my office is laminated, maybe I'll remember to bring it back next week, giant laminated New York Times map of 2012 voting patterns across the United States, county by county. And what you see that's so striking is that even states you think of as being red states or blue states are really much more sorted. So for example, if you look at Texas, Texas is a red state, red state, red state. If you look at Texas, what you see is big chunks of red rural areas, and then a bright blue island of Austin, Texas, right in the middle, because that's sorting going on. Or you think of Pennsylvania, which although until the 2016 election, Pennsylvania went Republican, Pennsylvania had been Democratic for a very long time before that. And you look at the 2012 map of Pennsylvania, when Pennsylvania voted Democratic, and what you see is giant blue island in Philadelphia, giant blue island in Pittsburgh, two big blue cities, and a lot of rural red in between, okay? And again, this phenomenon of geographic sorting is borne out by the data. Somebody wrote an article in the New York Times last year which they said, young people, if you really want to swing elections in this country, what you should do is go pick up and move back to Nebraska. If you really want to change things, all of you young people leaving Nebraska is shifting because the way the Electoral College works, it doesn't really matter if California has 2 million more Democratic votes than Republican votes or 4 million more Democratic votes than Republican votes. It's not making a difference. And so these geographic sorting patterns are actually play out specifically in electoral politics, but they also play out in whom do I talk to, whom do I know, whom do I spend time with, right? Do I only talk to people who agree with me? And again, increasingly in American society, that kind of political sorting is taking place. So I had the following conversation last year, which was a very, I'm going to shock you all, you probably weren't aware of this. Last year was a very fraught and contentious election year. I know you hadn't heard. Last year was a very fraught and contentious election year. And in schools, there was a lot of conversation about how do we handle talking about politics and talking about elections in schools. And so I was in a number of different conferences and education conferences and conversations. And at some point, I spoke to somebody from a fancy private school in Brooklyn. And I said, how do you handle political conversations in your school? Because in our school, it's very complicated. We have kids and families on both sides of the issue, and navigating it with intense feelings, and navigating that is very...
A day school?
No.
A private school?
Private secular, not day school at all. Fancy private school in Brooklyn. And they said to me, we don't have a problem. We don't have two different political views in our school. Everyone is of the same political view. And therefore, there is no difficulty. Now, of course, you and I both know that's not true. But it means the 3% or 5% who don't share the political views of the overwhelming majority keep quiet, go to ground, don't open their mouths in school. And that's really what's going on there. That's really what's going on there. But the school sense of it was, we have no difficulty, we have no conflict, we have no challenge because everybody thinks the same thing. Okay? So that geographic sorting, which is, again, a political sorting which is borne out by the data, contributes to the sense of separation, of atomization, of I look out for my tribe or my crew or my group, but not a broader sense of civic engagement, responsibility, and everything else. Yes? Now let's talk about the Jewish community for a minute. So my family and I, in the summers, so I have to say this, but then I have to explain it, because I say we go camping, but that's not really true. My husband and I do not camp. I'm not sleeping on a tent, I'm not sleeping outside, that's just not what I'm doing. So my husband and I either rent an RV or rent a cabin, but my children go camping. My children pitch a tent and sleep outside. We go away for a week. My kids sleep outside. It's actually really cute that they like to do that, but I'm not signing up for that, okay? And we basically, it's like a 6-hour radius from our house. Wherever you can drive to without having the kids in the car fight with each other too much, so that's where we go. So we've gone to upstate New York to the Finger Lakes region, and we've gone to Shenandoah National Park in Virginia, and we've gone to rural Maryland, and we've gone to Saco, sort of the Portland area in Maine. Just basically draw, that 6-hour radius around my house, wherever I can get to. We're going camping over the years. And basically every community that we've been to, we've managed to stumble across an abandoned old shul, an abandoned old cemetery. Because once upon a time, again, this is borne out by the data, the Jewish community in the United States was much more broadly distributed. There were many more Jews in many more small communities here, there, and everywhere. And what that meant was there was a shul. And if you went to shul, you went to the shul. Because that's what there was. And now, of course, we live much more concentrated in many fewer, much larger urban areas. And we don't have Jewish communities in all these places where Jews were all over the country scattered about. There's actually a whole issue with the upkeep of these abandoned Jewish cemeteries and people trying to raise money to maintain these Jewish cemeteries in communities where there aren't really any more Jews who are maintaining them, and what they're going to do about that. But as we've moved into these more concentrated areas, so we, ironically, in places where there are so many more Jews together, it's easier to be more atomized. When there were many fewer of us, we all just had to get together and make a shul and make a minyan and make a community and make it work. And when there were many more of us, we could start doing the thing, well, that shul, that rabbi, its religion, its politics, its approach, its way of thinking. I wouldn't darken their doorstep if you paid me. I only go to this shul, this rabbi, this approach, this politics. And that to some extent is a manifestation of our being much more concentrated in a very few. Obviously, Jews were always concentrated in some urban areas, like there were a lot of Jews in New York. But there were also Jews in Galveston, Texas. And there were also Jews in, all kinds of other places where. And when I found this old Jewish cemetery in East Stroudsburg, Pennsylvania, that was really just at the side of the road, and you see a cemetery. I'm like, wait, we have to. I study history. That's what I do. So my family knows. We're going to stop and see what this is. There's a little Jewish cemetery by the side of the road in East Stroudsburg, Pennsylvania, where once there was a small community, and once people had to figure out how to make their way and navigate, and now everybody, if they're still observant and if they're still committed, they're in one of a very few big urban communities, and we're sorting ourselves out. And in smaller communities, there may in fact still be a sense of we just all have to come together and make it work together because we're all we got. We sort by schools, right? We start drawing these super narrow ideological bands, schools, shuls, my precise line, and again, it's another manifestation of the big sort. Our own particular manifestation of the big sort, but another manifestation of the big sort. Here's a different axis along which we've sorted. The past 40 or so years has seen an enormous increase in socioeconomic inequality in the United States, in the concentration of wealth at the very top, and therefore of a growing divide between the very top and the rest of the country. Now, growing divide, I have to say, relative to what? The great leveling really happened in the generation since World War II. But in the generation from the World War II to the 70s, there was actually a great leveling. And there was a sense in which, it actually happened, that the top, the wealthiest, and the middle were much closer together. Okay? We know this from data like, how many multiples of an average worker's salary did the CEO make? So if in the 1960s the CEO made 30 times the average worker's salary, okay, that meant that the CEO was living in a much bigger, nicer house than the average worker was. But it didn't mean that the CEO was owning 10 houses around the world that he was flying to in his private plane, and he was living in a different universe than his worker. If today the average CEO is making 300 times what the CEO is making 300 times what the average worker makes, then he's not living in a nicer house in the same community. He's living a different life.
A different world.
Different life, a different world. I jump in my private plane, I fly between my 6 different homes. I actually never interact with hoi polloi, never cross paths with them. Okay? And again, this is something that is borne out by the data. A great deal of evidence to suggest that CEOs were, the gap between the CEO and the average guy used to be less. And therefore, they lived closer together. And their lives were, that doesn't mean the CEO wasn't better off, of course he was. But their lives were closer together in the immediate post-war period. And again, that creates a sense that there's a shared enterprise that we're all part of. When you're, I don't know what you are, the poor janitor toiling away on the factory floor, and I'm flying in my private jet between my 7 homes, I don't think of myself as having any particular shared interest with you. I'm not thinking about us as being part of the same enterprise that we are invested in, working together for our shared welfare. And so in addition to the big sort playing out in a political kind of way, where people live in communities along with people whose views they share, we see the big sort playing out in a socioeconomic sort of way. And all of these things contribute to the breaking down of some of the kinds of bonds that could cross across political lines. We can't be simplistic about this. It's not the case that, the United States is perfectly sorted. People have made the point that in Los Angeles County, which is a very populous county in a very blue state, but because it's such a big county and it has so many people in it, there are like more people voted Republican in Los Angeles County than in the state of Wyoming. Because the whole state of Wyoming only has a few 100,000 people in it, and Los Angeles County has millions of people living in it, and even if 3/4 of them are Democrats, the quarter of people in Los Angeles County who are voting Republican is more Republicans than the whole state of Wyoming. So we don't want to overemphasize or over-exaggerate the extent to which this is happening, but again, data does seem to bear out that there is sorting along these different axes, that there is separation, and that there is a concomitant lack of empathy, understanding, shared, even something as simple as like, is the economy on the right, the country on the right track or the wrong track, economy doing well and doing badly. And you watch the polling, and as long as Obama's president, Democrats think the country's doing great, and Republicans think the country's doing crummy. And as soon as Trump comes into office, the lines go like that. Now Republicans think the country's doing great, and Democrats think the country's doing crummy. In other words, we don't even have a shared sense of facts about, well, how's the economy doing? That should be a reasonably empirical question, regardless of how you feel about the president, right? But we've lost even shared sense of facts in everybody having their, okay, so we have, that I think is well enough established. Some people have pointed to, and again, I'm not making the case for bringing back the draft, but some people have pointed to the end of the draft, which ended during the Vietnam era, because of enormous student mobilization and student protest against the draft. And again, that's something that happens, almost 50 years ago at this point, not quite 50 years ago. I live in this country. I benefit from the country. Like, yay. Nobody's making me give anything back. I mean, I pay my taxes. Nobody's making me serve the country in any particular way. So my investment and my commitment, again, in this broader shared enterprise is attenuated, is weakened by the sense that I am not committed to or invested in any model of national service. If I want to, I can take time off from my career and go do Teach for America or AmeriCorps for 2 years. If I want to, I could join the United States Marine Corps also if I wanted to. Or I could do none of those things and just go from college to graduate school to my professional career to start making money, to buy my house in the suburbs, and I can do that also. And again, without trying to make the case for mandatory draft, which wouldn't be the thing that I would be recommending, but each of these pieces takes away from the sense that we are part of a shared enterprise, whether it's sociologically, socially, in the community I live in, politically, socioeconomically, as part of the country. And as we kind of pull apart from all of that, okay, here's another thing that we don't like to think about. Ready for a thing we don't like to think about? The thing we don't like to think about most in American life is race. We're just like, I don't want to think about that. That's like really, or we like to, or we say, okay, I'm going to think about that story, but I have a story I like to tell. Things are very bad, and there was slavery, that was bad. Then there was Jim Crow, that was bad. Then there was the Civil Rights Movement, Rosa Parks sat down on a bus, Martin Luther King gave his I Have a Dream speech, and then it was like all fixed, and everything's fine, and now we have nothing to worry about. And social scientists look at the history and the story around race in America, and it doesn't go like that. It doesn't end so nicely and prettily tied up with a bow. So here's something else that historians see is going on in America, which is another kind of sorting, right? We're talking about lots of kinds of sorting. This is another kind of sorting. Until the 1950s, the United States Supreme Court was willing to sanction segregated schools. It was willing to say segregated schools are okay. I mean, it said segregated schools are okay. And in 1954, in the Supreme Court case Brown versus the Board of Education, the United States Supreme Court says segregated schools are not okay anymore. You can't segregate schools by race. There were many Americans who were not keen to go to integrated schools or send their kids to integrated schools. They didn't really want to do that. You could no longer say this is the white school and this is the colored school. That was no longer an option. But here's what you could do. You could leave the city with a big, diverse population of people who would all be in the city's public school districts, and you could move out to a small suburban community that was probably still mostly white. And then, even if your schools were community schools, they weren't racially segregated schools, they were community schools. But since your community was pretty much white, your schools could be pretty much white. There's an historian at Princeton University named Kevin Cruz who wrote a book called White Flight, which documents the specific history of Atlanta, Georgia, but it's a story that's much bigger than Atlanta. And the story that Cruz tells in White Flight is of people who move out of Atlanta into the suburbs around Atlanta, because if you're in the big metropolis of Atlanta, once we integrate the schools and those Atlanta public schools start drawing from the whole racial population of Atlanta, your kids are going to be in integrated schools. If you don't want your kids in integrated schools, the thing to do is to move out to the suburbs around Atlanta, which are much smaller communities. Each little suburb is its own little community, and then it has its own school district and its own school. And then that's another way of sorting. So in addition to talking about sorting by politics and sorting by socioeconomic class, we have to talk about sorting by race. And we have to talk about sorting by race because whether we thought about it that way or not, whether we intended it that way or not, whether we were seeking that or not, many American Jews are living in suburban communities which were actually shaped by white flight, which were shaped by people escaping integrated schools, and that also becomes part of the sorting and part of the pulling apart from a broader sense of a shared enterprise and a shared commitment into a smaller, narrower. So I'm sorry to hear to diss the great state of New Jersey if that's where you're from, but I had heard many, many times over the years, New Jersey has more local governments than any other state. New Jersey has an insane number of local governments. And every local government has its own school district and its own school superintendent and its own school, and it's remarkably wasteful. And if you live in New Jersey, part of your property taxes are going to support this like endless proliferation of local governments. So when I first heard about this, and this was some time ago, I know what I thought it was. I thought it was like a kind of corruption light. You know, everybody carves out their own fiefdom. Oh, I'm the superintendent of East Nowheresville schools, and I'm the superintendent of West Nowhereville schools, and I'm the superintendent of Central Nowheresville schools, and everybody has a job being a superintendent of some school, and everybody can make a buck, and everybody can have an office and a title, and that's what I thought it was. Yes, it was like some kind of mild form of corruption. It's not really the right word. I'm sure there's a word for it that I'm not thinking of right now, but it was like everybody had their hand in the till. Everybody was getting something out of the
Patronage.
it was like a patronage thing out of tax dollars. As I started doing this research and doing this reading, I was like, oh, that's not what's going on there at all. Everybody needs their own school district because the bigger your district gets and the more diverse your district gets, your schools are getting integrated. And if you want to keep your schools, I mean, segregated is a loaded word, but that's what we're talking about. If you want to keep your kids all white, but you cannot say legally anymore, I want to keep my schools all white. That's not anymore after 1954 a thing that you can constitutionally say. What you say is, oh, I'm just the East Nowheresville School District, and that's the West Nowheresville School District, and that's the Central Nowheresville School District, and each one has its own school, and what do you know? East Nowheresville schools are all white, and Central Nowheresville schools are mostly black and Hispanic, and funny how that worked out that way.
New York State is so crazy that within Westchester County, there's not even any overlap between townships and school districts. A school district can have a piece of 3 different towns, and the vice versa. So that it's also, and it's very self-sorted.
Right, and I again, this is not just my sense or me speaking from my belly button. There is a very, very lot of evidence to suggest that all that sorting and line drawing didn't just happen to happen, that it was about preserving certain kinds of schools.
And don't Jews double down on that? I mean, or I should say Orthodox or committed, whatever descriptor you want to use. Don't they double down on that by only putting their kids in Jewish schools? So like not only are we living in self-segregated suburbs or even neighborhoods within cities, but we basically put our kids necessarily in 99% white schools where everyone is Jewish.
So I actually think that's a very challenging thing. As I've been doing this citizenship research through Machon Siach and working on this project and thinking about it, that question to me actually feels like, again, let me back up a second, sorry. Machon Siach is not just supposed to be about, like, let's do research and read Kevin Cruz's books about white flight, fascinating as that is. It's always supposed to come back into the school. So what is this teaching me that's going to make an impact on how I educate, right? I'm doing this fascinating research and I'm reading lots of books and it's great. How is that going to make a difference in how I educate kids in our school community, right? And so for me, that's one of the questions about this that actually becomes really central. If I take that seriously, if I say two things are true, you ready? Two things are true at the same time? Number one, this whole story about suburbanization and schools and another way of maintaining segregation, that's ugly and it's unpleasant to think about, that a lot of our very beautiful suburban communities were basically created to maintain segregated schools. Well, I don't like to think about that they were basically created to maintain segregated schools, but they were. If I think that's true, if I think it's true that our kids need to be in day school education, if we want them to be remotely knowledgeable and engaged Jews, they need the amount of exposure to Torah and Jewish values and Jewish learning and Jewish practice they're getting here. But if I take the first thing seriously, and I actually think that it's a problem, that we're becoming more atomized, more separated, let's even use the ugly word and say more segregated as a society, then I have to start to think seriously, what do I do to cross those lines, to create those connections, to reach out and integrate with other communities. And my kids are not going to go to public schools, because I do think they need to be in yeshivot or in day schools for all the reasons they need to be in yeshivot and day schools. But if I take that seriously as a problem or as a challenge, let's say it as a challenge. If I take that seriously as a challenge and I say, okay, great, they need to be in day schools, this is really important, Torah education, Jewish education is really important. What are we doing to overcome what you're absolutely right is the high 90% white nature of our school.
I live on the cusp of, a very, in theory, integrated neighborhood. I live right sort of on the border of Harlem, which is also the border of Spanish Harlem, which is also the border of incredibly affluent Carnegie Hill, Upper East Side Manhattan, which doesn't get whiter. And I have to work really hard to put my kids into integrative experiences. It's hard to find them, and that's I think part of that discussion of how do you.
So I'm not sure if I mentioned this to you last time. I don't remember in the discussion about citizenship, but I think I told you that one of the things that's happened as a result of this study and this thinking is to realize that we actually didn't teach citizenship very much. We teach American history very well, but we didn't actually teach what it means to be a citizen of the United States in a focused, thought-through way. So aside from the Machon Siach work, which is asking kind of more fundamental and theoretical questions, we're also engaged in a project that's working on citizenship education, developing ways for teaching citizenship. And this particular project is working on citizenship education in day schools and in Catholic schools. And there are two reasons for that. One reason for that is because this project is motivated by the idea that our values as religious people should inform how we think about being citizens. And therefore there's a common denominator that Jewish schools and Catholic schools can ask questions about what are our values as religious people and how do those values inform our citizenship. But the other very conscious thing that went into that is that not all Catholic schools in the New York area, but many Catholic schools in the New York area are attracting students from very different socioeconomic and ethnic and racial groups than are your typical New York area yeshivot. And if we work on shared citizenship education undertakings and have the kids work with each other on projects, with the local government or whatever it is, there's actually going to be an avenue that's created for a kind of interaction that doesn't exist right now, and that if you stop and think about it, you say, well, that's a challenge to us that we need to find space for it, so this is one way to find space for it. But I think that point, which again, I have to spend a lot of time thinking about as I started doing this work, about are we doing enough cheshbon hanefesh? Are we being conscious enough about the extent to which our kids are in this world that's sorted along so many axes, right? Politics, religion, socioeconomic class, but also race, and then what are we thinking about and doing to address this? I'm going to wrap up today's argument, and then we'll take questions, and then next time we're going to look and see if we can sort of bridge these two things, what it's going to mean to actively engage in a kind of broader vision of citizenship as a religious person. If last time we talked about the kind of specific Jewish approaches to government and how that might move us in the direction of looking out for our own and taking care of ourselves and not thinking about the government around us beyond that because of a lot of Jewish historical experience, today we looked at something much closer to home, which is the last 50 to 70 years of American experience, and how in different ways, very different ways than what we talked about last time, but you can see other kinds of patterns or pushes that push us towards a sort of focusing in on our own groups' needs, and not having a broader consciousness for the broader society that we're a part of. And we talked about a whole bunch of developments and trends that have been documented in American life, some of them starting in the 70s, some of them starting since World War II, depending on which particular trends we're talking about, and the ways in which Jewish communities are sometimes different than or apart from these trends, but very often are very much participating in them and are part of them. And that's a whole different set of pushes that moves us in the direction of not being fully engaged with the breadth of American society, but focusing on smaller groups of people who may be more similar to us along a variety of axes, again, religious, racial, socioeconomic, political. And once we are conscious of those developments, then we can maybe start to think about, okay, so if we're watching this happen to us, how do we work against that or push past that, or consciously shape modes of interaction that get us out of the atomization, right? The sorting, the atomization, the bull and the lone, the I'm on my own, or I'm only with people who are like me. I'm only with people who think and talk the way I do, who care about the things I care about, which then shapes a certain way that I engage in politics and engage in as a citizen. You got a question?
No, just a comment. There was a program yesterday between the 8th graders of SAR and the students at Atmosphere Academy. Atmosphere Academy meets in the Riverdale Jewish Center. It is, from my observation yesterday, totally black population of students. And the 8th graders came over to RJC from SAR and spent 3 hours together. Probably 100 SAR 8th graders, maybe more than 100 students at the Atmosphere Academy. They heard greetings from the biracial principal of the Atmosphere Academy, who declared himself biracial because he looked white to me, and his father, who was very light in color, from Rabbi Ganat, from Rabbi Krauss, did not speak at the point that I was there. And they started the program by having all of these students had arrived first because they meet in Riverdale Jewish Center. And then the SAR students came, so they sat separately. So you had black and white, and they started in some introductions and then showed the entire presentation by Martin Luther King in August of 1963. And then they spent I didn't stay for the rest of the program, but then they integrated together, and they had different kinds of opportunities to be able to analyze Martin Luther King. So this is the first time this has happened, because this is the first year of this place called the Atmosphere Academy. That may be an interesting, different kind of 9th graders that you're going to meet next year here. And I found it here in this community, which seems to be very white, a whole bunch of Orthodox synagogues where people will not go to the other guys or other gals' synagogue right here. And here was an attempt to bring these black young people, all of whom are they have particular uniforms that they're wearing, and the SAR students don't have uniforms, but they really do in a different kind of way. So it was an interesting experience yesterday. Again, the community was invited, and I think there were 2 community people who came, but I don't know who the other. Well, I do know who the other person was. So it was interesting. Just a postscript is 2 of the SAR students are my grandchildren, who will be here next year. And I wrote to them and to their parents later on that I want to follow up. I'd like to sit with them because I didn't experience the rest of the program. For me to find out how these grandchildren, who have lived totally in day school, totally in observant communities, totally isolated, totally sorted by their own parents, 12 months a year, day school, summer camp, Israel, everything that they're blessed with. It would be interesting to see what kind of effect, if anything, it will have in our community here.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that with us.
It is now more than half a century since Brown versus Board of Education, and I am struck by how resistant, particularly in the large cities, schools are to real integration, and how separate different populations continue to be. I don't know how much the business of creating school districts by ethnicity, what part it plays in that. But I would be curious to know.
So there is a very long and very, again, these things are very not pleasant for us to look at because the actual history is like really quite ugly. There's a very long and very ugly history of resistance to racial integration in schools when the federal government was actively forcing it through measures like busing. The integration levels of schools increased, and that was for about a generation. And then when the federal government backed off from those things, schools rapidly resegregated. There's a scholar of education, an observer of education. He's not really an academic, named Jonathan Kozol, who has written enormous numbers of books about public education in the United States and has documented the resegregation of American schools. And there's a much younger journalist who works for the New York Times who just won a MacArthur Genius Grant this year for her work on continued segregation in American schools. She's written a number of significant articles for the New York Times Magazine, one about New Orleans.
Her daughter also.
Nicole Hannah Jones, I'm not remembering her name, but you can look her up. And one of them was about her own daughter looking for a school in New York City and discovering that in New York City you still have districts and catchments for particular schools today in super liberal blue New York that are still being drawn to keep the black kids in this school and the white kids in that school. And the extent to which, there's no way to dance around this. Segregation still exists in schools because it's being maintained by white people who want to maintain segregation in schools. And except for a period of about 25 to 30 years, when the federal government was 25 years, when the federal government was pushing hard on that in the other direction, that has been the story in American life. And if we want that to change, there's two possibilities. One is that white people could change, but we're not volunteering to be first because we're sending our kids to usually vote, and we have to be honest about that. And the other possibility is that the government could once again take a much more heavy-handed approach to forced integration, which it hasn't except again for a very brief window, and once it stopped, people
So I'm not really sure how heavy the hand was. So for example, in New York State and in Connecticut, there is on state law books a rule that says that within a school district, the population of each individual school cannot vary by more than 25% from the average minority population. So it played out in New Rochelle, where they had 75% black schools and 25% black schools, fill in the blank. In other places, Stamford, Connecticut happened to say, that's not good enough for us, we're going to do 10%. But the word diversity figures in literature on Stamford, Connecticut going back to the 1850s.
But there was also an HBO miniseries. I'm blocking the name of it. David Simon did it about Yonkers and how Yonkers was still,
Yes, Yonkers was under court order for desegregation for decades.
Decades. But what was so fascinating about it is, and this was really wonderfully exhibited in this miniseries, was that they used the terms poverty. So what they were doing was that they were fighting low-income housing because they said it would reduce their property values. So they didn't want low-income housing. But what really was going on was low-income housing meant minority, and that meant school district. It was, the whole, this equals this equals that.
Her name, by the way, because she should have the right name, is Nicole Hannah Jones, and she's the reporter for the New York Times who won the MacArthur Genius Grant this year, specifically for her work on the persistent segregation and even resegregation of America's schools. This is a whole other conversation, which was not the conversation we were supposed to have today. But these kinds of issues exist in American life, and the first step to dealing with them is to acknowledge that they still exist. So when people say, oh, people just like to live in neighborhoods with other people like them, and they choose to live that way, there's a very great deal of evidence that that's not what's going on here. The lines are being very carefully drawn to separate the schools. And again, the courts and the government have stepped back over the last generation from trying to rectify that. And unless the first step is, again, acknowledging the kind of shared facts and reality of what's happening, and then we can talk about what one thing should or should not be done to address it. Thank you so much. Next week will be our third and final class in this series.